to be a part of today's program, which is really yesterday's program. But we are going to persevere here, and that's really the motto of the National Constitution Center. I am Mike Gerhardt, the scholar in residence here, also a constitutional law professor at the University of North Carolina, and I have the privilege of being able to moderate our program today. Before we get into that program, I just want to make a few announcements, if it's okay. To begin with, as you may know, we're going to be opening tomorrow a great new exhibit, Hamilton, the Constitutional Clashes That Shaped a Nation. The exhibit highlights the competing ideas of Alexander Hamilton and his legendary rivals, and includes artifacts such as Hamilton's writing desk and a number of rare documents. And that will be available for you to see through the end of the year this year. And today's Town Hall program marks the last event, as you may know, of the winter season, marked, of course, by the season itself. And we will soon announce the details for our spring and summer town hall season in the coming weeks. Please continue to check constitutioncenter.org/debate for newly added events. The spring and summer season will include a number of members' programs and events. And as you know, members of the National Constitution Center receive free tickets to daytime programs and discounted tickets to other events. And if you're interested in becoming a member of the National Constitution Center, visit the membership table in the Kirby lobby for more information on how to join today. And I will also then ask you to silence your cell phones or other devices, which is make it easier for us to hear. And without further ado, I will introduce our wonderful, wonderful speaker. Jon Michaels is professor of law at UCLA. His scholarly and teaching interests include constitutional law, administrative law, national security law, separation of powers, presidential power, regulation, bureaucracy, and privatization. After graduating from Yale Law School, he clerked first for Judge Guido Calabresi of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, and then for Justice David Souter of the U.S. Supreme Court. And immediately prior to his appointment at UCLA, he worked as an associate at Arnold & Porter's National Security Law and Public Policy Group in Washington, D.C. He's going to talk to us today about his recent book, Constitutional Coup, Privatization's Threat to the American Republic, which he will be signing copies of after the program. So I want you to welcome Jon from Los Angeles. We're going to begin with some basics, if it's okay. In fact, Jon and I could not have gotten here, I think it's fair to say, without the administrative state. I came up from North Carolina, he came from California. Somehow we got here, and we're going to make this event happen. And we thank everybody that made it possible. But the subject that Jon's writing about, sometimes called administrative law, once was described by the great judge and academic Robert Bork as like eating sawdust with butter. I have no idea how he knew that, but it does mean, I think, that it will be helpful for us to have some understanding of some of the basic concepts and themes that Jon's writing about so insightfully. So one of the first ones is really separation of powers and how the original Constitution dealt with that concept.
So separation of powers is a cornerstone of our government. We hear talk of separation of powers often connected to checks and balances, and they work off of each other kind of hand in hand. When we think about it, it's all about creating opportunities for friction, for rivalry, for different groups to have opportunities to have their say and to push back on other people's say or other institutions' say. And this is the kind of cornerstone of this, of course, is our three-branch government, where lawmaking is divided and separated from executive power, which is divided and separated from the interpretive power of the courts. If those are commingled, there's a concern that it's easier to gain control, for a small group to gain control over the entire apparatus of the government and drive policy in either a dangerous or a hyper-partisan fashion. And one of the goals of this book is to think about how that framework, that core framework, also operates not at the kind of grand stage of the Senate, the House, and the presidency, but also in the inner workings of government, where so much gets done today through agencies, through all the agencies that you hear about, and maybe a little bit sawdust, a little bit of butter, but they're quite important today.
Well, in fact, so it may be helpful as well to think about when, if we could use the term administrative law starts, when do the first agencies sort of appear? And what is an agency, by the way?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so an agency is it's a designated institution, almost always created by Congress, funded by Congress, and given a mission by Congress to carry out some responsibility. It could, often they're broad: protect the environment, protect clean air, take care of define and then take care of endangered species, make sure that airplanes are safe. And so these entities exist. They're quite large today. And what they're tasked with doing is a lot of the work that is hard for Congress to do in terms of the expertise to figure out exactly how much pollution is safe, or exactly how much purity, what's the purity level of a given pharmaceutical. And so it's delegated to agencies who have the expertise and the time to work these out. And these set some regulations which look a lot and feel a lot like law. And then they also go and enforce to make sure that airlines or petrochemical plants are following these regulations. And so surrounding these powers, there had to be law, of course. Law had to develop around it, and that's what we normally think of as administrative law. It's essentially requiring the agencies that have all these new powers to be disciplined, to be accountable, to be transparent, and to essentially follow directives so that they don't run away with federal power in a way that's obviously unconstrained.
So I want to get into some of the constitutional foundations for administrative law, particularly for delegations to agencies. But as you write about in your book, there are different phases with regard to the constitutional law, sort of before the 20th century, even earlier in our history, not long after 1789. What would have been the constitutional arguments for Congress giving some of its power to what would have then been an analog to an agency?
So early on, we didn't, and this goes back to the part of the question that we didn't get to, and I apologize for that. What did the administrative state look like early on? And it probably best described as a proto-administrative state. It was very skeletal, and in part, that was reflective, not just or responsive or attentive, not just to what maybe Congress thought the courts would be okay with, but also the kind of place where we were as a country, as a society, where governance was much more local. The federal government was a very small part, a relatively small player. And technology and kind of awareness was such that we didn't have either the need or the impetus to regulate as extensively as we do today, because different groups, the marginalized groups, weren't attended to, and those are often the ones that benefit the most from regulation. So if we're looking at this, a pre-Civil War period, we have a very small, kind of pocketed regulatory apparatus. And so we didn't have many kind of direct challenges or questions arising in this period of time. There were building, the Bank of the United States would be an example where there was a kind of a constitutional questions that arose. But oftentimes in the very early period, the delegations were quite narrow, and the delegations were often directly to the president at that time himself. So we see the question about whether Congress is giving enough guidance for an executive actor, again, often the president, to carry out certain responsibilities. And the courts at that time, maybe because there were such modest delegations, we didn't find much friction in those early periods.
Now, of course, another concept that's fundamental to your book, that's central, in fact, to the book, is privatization. Yeah. So if we go back to that early period, was there privatization, and if so, what did it look like?
Yeah. Okay. So privatization today. If we could start there and then go back. So what do I mean by when I talk about privatization, this project? It's the outsourcing of essential government functions. So it's private actors carrying out responsibilities that otherwise would be carried out by government officials. Mm-hmm. At the time of the founding, and really for the first let's say, 70, 80, 100 years, there wasn't such a sharp distinction in responsibilities between the public and the private. Government officials often had side jobs as farmers or laborers or craftsmen, and the government was quick to have various private actors carry out some public functions here and there. Again, that's part of the understanding that we didn't, the state was small, the federal government was small, and state and local governments were small too, and we didn't have at that point built up kind of an ethos of public law such that there'd be a big difference between whether a public actor carries out the responsibility or a private actor. Everything was much more fluid. We were just kind of feeling our way, which is very kind of topical today too when we think about commingling of public and private responsibilities at the highest level of government. So at the time, it was much more fluid than it became, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, where we drew kind of sharp lines. And we could talk about why that was meaningful, but early on, it wasn't a big deal that we wanted a small government, and we didn't have a strong kind of sense of that private is the direct pursuit of profits, and the government has some kind of higher or at least different calling.
So, in fact, I do want to go to that question.
Yeah.
And so, of course, we're going to be concerned here with what changed.
Yeah.
There's going to be the rise of of the so-called administrative state. How does that happen?
So, part of the way it happens is we had the Industrial Revolution. And so all of a sudden we became much more sensitive to the way the national economy had to be regulated in a way that wasn't true when we just were a country of farmers and shopkeepers. And we realized that there was this massive group of laborers who were potentially, let's say, compromised in the workforce. And we also realized that there was a major group of consumers who would also be affected, perhaps negatively affected, by industrialization. At the same time, the franchise, the vote, was expanded so that these groups that I earlier referenced as marginalized, while they weren't fully kind of empowered, they were slowly brought into the political process and slowly found opportunities for kind of legal redress as well. So we became more sophisticated. That's part of the story, and that's when we really ramped up the development of agencies. Also, the Civil War, after the Civil War, the national government took on heightened importance simply because of the way in which states were governing themselves earlier on. At the same time, we grew frustrated with, in part, this kind of, it doesn't matter if it's public or if it's private actors. The public government officials weren't that let's say, capable and competent. This was the era of, folks may recall the term spoil system. So the Jacksonian democracy brought in this understanding that government jobs would be filled by kind of ward heelers, patrons of the campaign. And they weren't necessarily technocrats. They weren't experts. They were filling a job, and then it was understood that once the campaign season ratcheted up, they would ease up on their daytime jobs and work on the campaign. So we didn't have such a strong government workforce. And over time, in the decades after the Civil War, became frustrated with it. We became very frustrated with the fact that now we need technical competence, and we don't necessarily have it. We also became kind of sensitive to the fact that the spoil system was incredibly burdensome. You constantly had to be shuffling through workers, so there was not much institutional knowledge, and there was a lot of people banging on politicians' doors. So the kind of good governance movement created a professional class around the same time as we were scaling up the administrative apparatus itself to intervene more directly in the American political economy.
Well, in fact, as you write about in the book, and I'm going to probably shorten it too much here in my description, there are at least a couple major statutes, in fact referred to as super statutes, which in a sense frame the rise of the administrative state. Interestingly enough, the usual explanation for the rise of the administrative state is put on the shoulders of Franklin D. Roosevelt. But if we look at these statutes, it actually turns out that the couple of presidents who are important here, strangely enough, are Chester Arthur and Richard Nixon. And Chester Arthur gives us the Pendleton Act, and then later Richard Nixon. So what are these statutes, and why are they so important?
So the first statute is the Pendleton Act, which is essentially the beginning of federal civil service creation. And we call it civil service reform, but it was really the creation of a professional class that would be, over time, cover in its heights about 90% of the federal civilian workforce. What happened over time? Again, the first statute was a pretty minor step, but it laid the foundation for the kind of depoliticization of the federal workforce. So the federal workforce could not be hired, fired, promoted, demoted based on what that person's political, let's say, ideology or commitments are. And that paved the way for having a permanent workforce that would serve across administrations and largely serve ably. And what does that do? It takes some of the politics out of the day-to-day governance. And we could talk about whether that's good or bad, or why it's at least good when it's counterpoised with a president who has a strong political agenda. And so that's the starting point. It also gives, again, what I referenced before, stability over time. Person stays in government, person learns the ropes, person knows how the trends change over time and don't change over time. You don't have the kind of, oh, what am I going to do moment that we have when a administration changes hands, as it does every 4 to 8 years. So that was a major step. And the second step, I'd go a little bit before Nixon. I would talk about something that's really in the weeds, but we'll just talk about it briefly and quickly jump out of the weeds, is the Administrative Procedure Act, okay, which was enacted under Truman. And what the Administrative Procedure Act recognizes that, hey, we've been doing this administrative governance, this regulation, for at least 50, 60 years, if not earlier. We need to standardize this. We need to create a framework to allow for public oversight, for public participation, for judicial review, for formalizing the way in which agencies do their business. And if anything, the APA is like a mini constitution for all these agencies, for the millions of people who work for agencies and for the hundreds of millions of people who are affected by agencies. And so I put those two up as my pillars for informing the way in which the public has access to the regulatory regime and in which we have a expert class that helps govern on a day-to-day the regulatory regime. And I put those two in connection with the president who leads the agencies.
And so, and as that administrative regime, of course, expands, we face some criticisms.
Yes.
And so I want to sort of explore a couple of those criticisms, and then that I should provide an introduction to privatization.
Okay.
So what could possibly be criticized with the rise, with the expansion of this administrative regime? Yeah.
So to start at the basics for what could be criticized, I know the laughter suggests that folks are at least attuned to what's going on today, and we will. I hope we can get to that. But the concern at the time, the concern at the time was simply a fear of federal power. So when I say that at the time, in the 30s, for instance, so Mike is right to say that we really associate the rise of administrative governance with Franklin Roosevelt, because under Franklin Roosevelt's watch, that's when agencies scaled up in importance, both on the domestic front, regulating the economy, and also a major staple of the administrative state has a national security component to it, and we had to ready ourselves, fight, and then figure out what to do in the aftermath of World War II. So we had this massive administrative state. And that's when the courts get involved, and that's where we start seeing challenges. What were the first set of challenges is people, mostly industrialists, didn't want to be regulated. It's the story about how cases come to courts are pretty familiar stories, that there was self-interest involved. But from a kind of a more, let's say, an impartial perspective, the concern was, hey, I read the Constitution, I know the Constitution, I don't see anywhere in the Constitution any type of allowance for an administrative apparatus, for unelected bureaucrats, for agencies, not Congress, engaging in essentially rulemaking to figure out what the proper standards should be for workplace safety, for wage and hour laws, et cetera, et cetera. And so the first set of challenges we see is there's no justification for this power, which is both greater than what the Constitution seems to provide for, and is too detached from the three branches of government.
And so how then does privatization, in a sense, kind of work with those criticisms? At what point does privatization begin to sort of expand itself? Or that is to say, government allows for the expansion of privatization?
So privatization comes in a little bit after those battles are fought and settled. So the long and short of those battles were the courts recognized the central importance of agencies and gave them essentially the constitutional valorization. They said, provided that Congress is furnishing what they call an intelligible principle, which we could just refer to as guidance, it's okay for agencies to be carrying out these responsibilities. And once that happened, that was in the mid-30s, once that happened, the agencies took off. Congress was okay with it. Congress was happy to pass law after law to allow for the agencies to essentially run the federal government. Privatization comes in later, after the administrative state becomes, let's say, a major player, if not the dominant player in mid-20th century America. And privatization comes in with some frustration with the now central place that agencies play in our lives. And so the story for me really picks up in the 70s, the 80s, and into the 90s.
So tell us that story. And what's the story that supports privatization? And also, how much is it? How much of it is there?
So concern with bureaucratic governance, administrative governance, picks up as an intellectual movement in the schools, the economic schools and the political science schools at various places. University of Chicago had a kind of a neoliberal, neoclassical understanding of economics that thought that understood the way to motivate workers, the way to drive organizations is through a profit motive. And that the problem with this bureaucracy that I described is that they're too insulated. They're too comfortable in their jobs. And that leads to apathy and ineffectiveness. And what we really need to do to jumpstart the country is to import market principles. So we see that happening. And that's an intellectual movement. And then we get into the 70s and we see that intellectual movement kind of finds a partner in politics. The changes to the regulatory scheme in the late 60s and 70s brings in new groups of beneficiaries that weren't part of the New Deal coalition. It's a lot of people of color. The civil rights movement gets attached to it. Different new groups come in that the original New Deal supporters weren't necessarily as enthusiastic about. Okay, and that's where we get a break, and some of those voters are then called Reagan Democrats, and we can come back to Reagan in a second. We also get economic what's called stagflation in the 70s, where we don't have enough money. Or we perceive ourselves not to have enough money to carry a big, bloated administrative state. So we need to think about ways to kind of cut costs and eliminate what we think, what some people thought of as a bloated bureaucracy. That comes into play. And the third piece, and perhaps the piece that I think is in some ways the most interesting, is privatization becomes a second best scenario for what's often referred to as the Reagan Revolution. So the 60s, we have the intellectual movement. The 70s, the politics, the kind of a backlash against the administrative state happens. 1980s, Ronald Reagan comes into office and basically says, I'm going to tear down the administrative state. I'm going to tear it down. I'm going to get federal government out of everyone's business. He's got these great lines about the most dangerous words in the English language is I'm from the government. I'm here to help you. So Reagan comes in. He's going to slash the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. He's going to shut down agencies. Doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. Turns out people really like these agencies. They may not like the administrative state abstractly. They may not like the agencies that help you, but they like the agencies that help themselves. And so he gets some resistance. Meanwhile, there's military buildup. So spending is rising at an unsustainable level. Plus, the Reaganites want to cut taxes. Okay, so something has to give here. He can't cut the EPA. What can we do? These folks at Chicago, these folks at the conservative think tanks in D.C., they've been floating these ideas about privatization. Mm-hmm. We can cut costs by transferring responsibilities to the private sector, whom we think will do the job better or cheaper. And that's how privatization comes into the fold. It's not an attack. It's not a direct attack on the responsibilities themselves, but it's an attack on those who carry out those responsibilities, who are ultimately then the ones that are more easily discarded than the regulations.
So I want to sort of, I guess, break this question into two parts. And you acknowledge it's difficult to get a handle on the precise scope of privatization. Yeah. What's your rough estimate on how much of it there is, costly or otherwise? And then I'll follow up.
So it depends on how you define privatization. For me, it's the contracting out of government responsibilities. And so I don't include there the costs that are associated with building a fighter jet. That's obviously a huge cost, but we've never been in the business of building our own fighter jets. Okay. For me, what matters is the contracting out of the responsibilities for those who are in welfare offices and are making determinations on whether you do or don't get your benefits. Mm-hmm. Making the decision whether we buy the fighter jet or we stick with what we have. Doing the rounds to do environmental inspections, up to and including, a big piece of this, or a very salient piece of privatization in the 21st century has been private security forces, military contractors who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. So if you think about that universe, numbers are tough, but the numbers generally are, it may be a 1-to-1 ratio between federal civilian employees and federal contractors carrying out service responsibilities. And the numbers look even, my understanding is the numbers are even more dramatic at the state and local level. And in terms of numbers for personnel, we're talking billions. For sure, billions. And that's, again, before you talk about leaving aside we need a new aircraft tanker, or we need a new building, and a new government building is going to obviously be built by people in the commercial sector.
And so I appreciate you giving us several examples of it, because I want to sort of be able to enable all of us to have sort of ideas of what this privatization looks like. Another example you gave, which combines some of the different points you've been making today, relates to teacher tenure.
Yeah.
And how the dismantlement of teacher tenure may itself go hand in hand to some extent with the effort to privatize. And we may see that a lot in the news. What other examples could you give us of privatization across the board, just in different areas?
Oh yeah, sure. So teacher tenures of fun is the wrong word, but it's a media example that we could talk about. And we could talk about how it plays in or doesn't play in. But it could be everything from the folks who actually sit down and draft the first the first kind of cut at the regulations that involve all the things that we care about, whether it's how are we going to implement Obamacare, or how are we going to tackle climate change and regulate greenhouse gases. We have contractors who are preparing the memoranda for the talking points when the cabinet secretary appears before a Senate investigatory committee. We have contractors who manage prisons, who are prison guards, who are at the state and local level, who provide essentially police forces. It runs the gamut. It runs the gamut from, let's say, alcohol counseling and welfare counseling to the highest levels of intelligence analysts, such as a person whose name might be familiar to you, Edward Snowden.
And of course, one of the things you write about extensively in the book, particularly in the third part, is sort of a metric that we may be able to develop for determining the extent to which the phenomenon you just described threatens either the Constitution or threatens the administrative state. So give us a sense then of what metrics there are. I mean, obviously, I can imagine one response you've probably heard a lot is, well, wouldn't the contracting be more efficient, or could it be better done? And you have a response to that.
So I look at it differently, and this goes, I think, back to our very first question. Okay. For me, what actually legitimates the administrative state is that it recreates the constitutional separation of powers. Remember, the constitutional system, when we do congressional lawmaking, we have Congress, the president, and the courts all having input. They're all autonomous, they're all rivalrous, they all have input. At least the conditions are set up for them to be autonomous, rivalrous, and have input. Okay, obviously Congress, whether Congress does it in a particular instance or whether the courts are up to the task in a particular instance is a separate point, but the framework is set up as such. Okay. When we create the administrative state, the issue for me, or the concerns I have about the administrative state, were not simply the ones that were articulated in the 1930s by the court. For me, it's the consolidation of lawmaking, law enforcing, and law interpreting powers into one agency. That was the kind of beauty of it, but also the danger of it. Mm-hmm. And for me to say that if you really have a problem with agencies, and you're not something that we refer to in the business as an originalist, who thinks that whatever the framers said dictates every part of our ability to govern going forward. I know it's not the most charitable interpretation, but if you're not tethered so much to the specific language and the specific moment in which the Constitution was created, what you really should be concerned about, if you care about the structure of our government, the principles underlying it, is a danger of consolidated power. And honestly, the agencies run that risk. And here's the way I say why I say don't worry about it. If you open up the black box of agencies, you see a triangulated system of separation of powers, because you have the president appoint the agency heads. Okay, those are the folks we see on TV and we hear about all the time. Those are the president's deputies. Those are generally expected, or they're generally expected to carry out the will of the president. Okay, so if those folks had the entire control, then we would have modern governance being dictated entirely by the presidency. Because as I said, most of governance today is carried out through agencies, not through Congress. But we don't have to worry about that so much, because we have the bureaucrats. And remember, I said that the bureaucrats are insulated from politics. They're professionals. They can't be fired for pushing back on the president, whether the president is Barack Obama or George Bush or Donald Trump. They're allowed the autonomy and the independence to push back. And the third group, when you look inside the black box, is us. And that goes back to when I referenced the Administrative Procedure Act that empowers us to participate meaningfully in most facets of administrative governance. So inside the agencies, there actually is the potential for the same amount of rivalry and counterbalancing and pluralistic, people from different walks of life being able to influence the decision as we see on the constitutional level. Okay, so why am I talking about that? Why did I go down that path? Because that's how I think about privatization. Mm-hmm. If privatization subverts that system, it is dangerous. And here's how I think it subverts that system. Okay, privatization cuts out the bureaucrats. If they cut out the bureaucrats, you've lost that independent voice. Oftentimes when the private actors, contractors make the news, it's because they've engaged in some scandalous behavior. Cost overruns, shoddy service. That is true, but government officials often do the same thing. What concerns me more about contractors is actually when they're really compliant. They know exactly how they're getting paid. They want their contracts renewed. They can be fired in a way that civil servants can't be fired. So they're going to be super compliant. The good contractors are going to be yes men and yes women for the presidency. And that's how we lose that tension. The bureaucrats will push back. The bureaucrats say that's not what Congress wants. The bureaucrats will say that's inconsistent with what we've been doing in the past. And a contractor, again, I'm painting with a broad brush, but a contractor is more likely to say, okay, boss, you got it. And that distresses me because we've lost that very important, that very central tension that otherwise is baked into our system. The other part is when contractors handle a lot of these responsibilities, those responsibilities are shunted into private corridors. And that eliminates our ability to participate as well. The agencies are more or less open and accessible. But however more or less they're accessible, they're much more so than a private entity that's developing a new welfare policy. So for me, the test of when privatization is bad is when it subverts that system that we've developed over time of a rivalrous, pluralistic administrative governance apparatus.
I appreciate that. So I've just begun to look at some of the questions from the audience, and of course they are terrific. And I'm going to begin with this next one partly because I was already thinking about this. And it has to, I think the essence of this question has to do with the extent to which how contractors that you just referred to, private contractors, how they're held accountable as opposed to how the bureaucrats you talk about are held accountable. Yeah. What are those different accountability systems, and is one better than the other? Yeah.
So proponents of privatization will say contractors are much more accountable. If you don't like what they do, you toss them out the next day. They're also more accountable because they're competing with other firms in the industry to get the business. That is the economic argument in favor of privatization, is that there's internal and external market forces that make them better capable of serving the public. Those folks will also say it's very hard to discipline civil servants. And I think that's relatively true. It's not easy to fire someone. You have to make a huge stink and make life miserable for civil servants, as, again, we're seeing some of that today, but that's largely unprecedented. So you have the danger of having the apathy that I referenced before that doesn't hold the civil servants accountable. Okay. That is the story. That is one of the stories for privatization. Okay. Here's the other story about privatization, or here's the story that I think needs to be told as well. The government may say it cares about cost, but the agency heads care about political expediency. They're willing to pay a little more. And it's true, contractors have by and large not shown themselves to be more economically efficient, and yet every year we have more privatization. So there must be some other reason we keep on going back to that well. And the reason why we're going back to that well, in at least many contexts, is because you get the yes men and the yes women who will carry forward the agenda. They are more responsive, but that responsiveness to me is a double-edged sword. Yeah, they may be more efficient, but but that compliance may be problematic in a system in which we at least may, and for me, I do privilege friction. Friction is the cornerstone, as I started, with the constitutional system. We have to pay for that. We pay for inefficiency. That is the accountability check, is that we have cranky bureaucrats. And some of the cranky bureaucrats will be unreasonably cranky, and I get that. And that to me is the cost of doing business for the principled cranks who are actually holding a very important line and doing the work that we need them to do. So that's how I would play off the idea about accountability. Is it all depends on what your goal is.
No, I appreciate that. And I'm going to work through a number of these questions now in no particular order, if that's all right. So this question asks as follows. President Trump has cut out many government regulations, curtailed the implementation of the ACA, and is attempting to decentralize the administrative control from Washington. Is there a positive rationale for these actions at this time in American history?
There are positive arguments for, taking the last point, for decentralizing some administrative responsibilities, which I think is different from devolving. And now I'm going to be really nerdy for a second, which is, so decentralizing means having more agency departments or offices outside of Washington, more federal departments outside of Washington, helping steer policy. And I think that's a good thing because it brings us, not just us who can get to the Beltway, or can hire someone to lobby for us into the administrative process. So I think that's well taken. Though I worry at this particular moment there's a different agenda that underlies it or motivates it. Are we at a moment now where we have too much regulation? I don't know if that's true. I'm skeptical of that being true. There are always some regulations that don't work particularly well. But we can also trust the experts in collaboration with the political heads who are saying, don't push so hard on that. If the experts, the ones who are apolitical, say, yeah, you know what, we don't have to aggressively enforce that. We won't have this issue of overzealous enforcement where it's untoward, because it has to be. There's the consent of the bureaucrats plus the political leadership. So I'm skeptical of these ideas that we can count how many regulations. And we now have a policy, I believe, it's the policy of the federal government, that for every new rule, you have to take away a rule. And one of my colleagues at UCLA had this great line about this, where she said it reminded her of the scene from Amadeus, where the king is listening to the music and says, too many notes. That's his critique, too many notes. Without any understanding of how they all synthesize and they all harmonize together, too many notes. And I feel like we're at a danger that's the moment we're in today. That we just feel like saying there's too many notes, when we can actually think about how these notes are working and together to create something bigger than any one provision. So
the next couple of questions sort of are going to press you a little more on maybe the defense of the for lack of a better way of putting it, the traditional administrative state. One question asks you to comment on McLean's democracy in chains. The other question asks you about the problem of regulatory capture.
Yeah.
You might want to explain those concepts if you don't mind.
Yeah. Okay. So capture. Let's focus on capture and maybe loop into democracy of change in the context of that. Capture is another reason to be skeptical of bureaucracy. But we'll also talk about why it also might have the same, if not stronger effect when they talk about contractors. So the concern with capture is that agency officials become too cozy with the industry they regulate. And if they're too cozy with the agency they regulate, they're going to look the other way. They're going to pass regulations or set enforcement priorities that are not necessarily in the best interest of the public, but that makes them have a good working relationship with the folks that they're in cahoots with, as it were. And one of the reasons why there's a fear of this is another concept, which is the revolving door. Mm-hmm. The revolving door is I've come from this industry, or I've come from this public interest side. It doesn't have to just be corporate capture. I've come from this public interest side, and when my time in government is over, I'll roll back into it. And so not just my financial incentives to be cozy, but also my worldview is informed by the professional choices I'm making. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so the concern with agencies is there's too much capture. In some ways, my defense of a strong and more powerful civil service is, in some ways, is a way of insulating them from capture as well. So not just political pressure from up top, but if you have a good job that you know will be there for the rest of your life and it's meaningful, and you are not called names, and you're not called disloyal, and you are given meaningful work, and you don't have to look over your shoulders for contractors, you're much less likely to be lured by the private sector. If we have, as we're having increasing number of what they call political layering, where there's deputy assistant secretaries and the assistant to the assistant deputy secretary, those are all part-time jobs. Those are all short-term jobs. Those jobs, if anything, are much more likely to lead to opportunities in the private sector than for the civil service. So I do agree that regulatory capture is a problem. But I actually think it's more of a problem the more we have kind of a political framework in place for agencies. The other part of this that I think is getting at is that we're not very good at, we the people, are not very good at taking seriously that third component of administrative governance, mm-hmm. which is when I say, you guys are all empowered to be part of the administrative state. And you say, great, thanks. I don't know what that means, and I'm not sure I want to do it. All fair. Okay, so when agencies publish notices of regulations, they publish in something called the Federal Register, which I'm guessing, and it's okay, that most of you don't read. Or would even know how to find, and certainly wouldn't know how to find in a pre-internet era, where you couldn't just Google it and find it. So that's our notice to the public, which to me is laughable, if not absurd, that to expect us to get involved in those ways. And so the latter part of the book has reforms, and I recognize that the structure of administrative governance that I've laid out, that I champion, needs some boosts. And one of the boosts it really needs is to better figure out a way to allow for greater public engagement, public participation, so we don't have simply the big repeat players driving administrative policy. And by the way, a lot of those lessons carry over into the constitutional sphere as well. A lot of us feel disempowered, even though we have a vote with our representatives in Congress because of runaway campaign finance kind of policies. And so to the extent the public feels disengaged at the vis-a-vis Congress, I think the same is true at the administrative stage as well. So I recognize that the framework I've set up, if I just say, okay, look, we have it, everything's cool, that's not what I'm saying. We have it, now we need to nurture it and rebuild it, in part because we've lost some ground since that mid-20th century apex.
Well, you're going to be pressed further.
Okay.
So the states' rights factions say that local and state governments, because they're close to the public, sorry, I can't make it, are better to spend tax dollars on than perhaps the bureaucratic state.
Yeah.
So that may be another way of asking, sort of, are we better off delegating more authority back to the states and localities and having the federal government do less?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm agnostic for purposes of my project, my politics are obviously different, but in terms of my project doesn't depend on a big or small administrative state at the federal or state or local level. In fact, some of you could challenge me and say, well, if you're going to put all this extra friction in the federal administrative state, aren't you going to get less done, particularly if you get a president who you like, who you want to run things? Like Barack Obama short-circuited a lot of the checks and balances that I hold dear. And so my theory is in some ways politically neutral and actually could have bad, could adversely affect some of my personal interests or my personal preferences. The state and local level, that's fine. I don't have a take on whether the federal government should be bigger or smaller, as long as we are thoughtful about it. Same thing with state and local government. I would say that if you value the institutions that I value, there is concern that the civil service at the state level is even more compromised than the civil service at the federal level. There's also concern that that public participation is even more driven by special interest at the state and local level than it is at the federal level. So if these are the types of issues that, or if these are the types of institutions that you value as informing and helping shape the kind of American regulatory agenda, there might be reasons to be concerned about state and local government apart from what's the best locus of regulation. Like the environment, it's a national problem. Sanitation might be a local problem. Apart from that, you might think also, what is the framework for having kind of a sound and let's say inclusive administrative apparatus?
I'm going to ask another question from the audience in just a second, but so I just want to get again at some of the core concepts we're dealing with. Again, one of the things we might hear a lot about, especially in the political marketplace, is, well, one way to deal with the administrative state is to starve the beast, give it less money. Yeah. But I'm particularly curious here. Who's the beast? What's the beast that one's trying to tame through starvation? That is the source of that question.
Yeah, I think the beast is kind of a moving target, or it's a bit of a cipher. It's whatever people want it to be. And so I think the Reagan example works well in terms of this question. I think Reagan thought the beast was environmental regulation. When that beast became too powerful to confront, he went after the little brother, which were the civil servants. I think today, the concern that we hear mostly is attacks on the people. The people. This is the idea about a deep state and the subversiveness. And so if we cut off funding, we're going to limit the autonomy of the people. Which to me is a very different set of arguments than we should be out of the business of federal regulation of education. Which would be the kind of old school beast. The old school beast, the 70s and 80s critique was there shouldn't be a Department of Energy, or there shouldn't be a Department of Environmental Protection. Today, I think it's turned much more personal.
Mm-hmm. And so here's the next question from the audience. How does the growth of lobbyists figure into this equation?
Yeah. So lobbyists is a hard question. If lobbyists are essentially just proxies for busy people, and they're representing all interest, well then that's a fine. It's not an unproblematic story, but it's a relatively straightforward story. Unfortunately, that's not true. What we have today are lobbyists that are essentially domineering that third part of the administrative apparatus. And we have are the ones sending in all the comments on rules, on the ones asking for all the greater transparency in the records. So the kind of structural inequalities of our economy are let's say, our tolerance for an unregulated political space of that sort have fueled greater, let's say, opportunities for the sort of driving policy in a way that's not necessarily reflective of the people's larger agenda. So short answer, they're a problem. They're a problem they're symptom, but this is a symptom of a larger pathology in our kind of political, legal, and economic culture.
And let me just ask about another critique before I give you a chance to talk about your positive prescription at the end. And again, I do that in part because I think it'll help clarify for all of us how you conceive of, as you put it, the path forward. So another critique, and it's maybe just a variation of some of the ones we've heard before, is that regulation, or one might call it overregulation, is bad for business.
Yeah.
So to what extent would that either call for privatization or non-regulation?
Yeah. So again, to the extent this calls for privatization, what it's going to lead for, I think privatization is actually bad for business. And it's bad for business for the following reason. So a Democrat wins, a Democrat puts in all of his or her contractors, and regulatory policy flies to the left. Okay. 4 years later, a Republican wins. Those contractors are out, or there's same contractors who simply now say yes, sir, to a different boss. And policy flies to the right. That's an unstable business model. Businesses if businesses think they can get deregulation for a long period of time, that's okay. But I'm not sure they want to switch on a dime all the time. And I'm not sure that's good for us. But I think the broader question had to do with why is it good for business to be why is regulation good for business? And what I talk about in the book, and what I largely believe is an answer, and I referenced him before, is in a critical light about short-circuiting the levers of bureaucracy. But Barack Obama, in his campaign re-election, said to kind of chastised business leaders and said, remember, you didn't build this on your own. The basis for this is built: the roads, the schools, the policing, the clean air, the clean water, the safe neighborhoods. You didn't build this business from scratch. You built this business on the shoulders of an institutional apparatus that made life easy for folks, or easier for folks. And he got chastised for that. And he said, no, that's not true. That's not fair. And he backpedaled. Okay. And I think he shouldn't have backpedaled. I think he said, no, I meant it. Okay, we had the regulatory system in place allows Silicon Valley to flourish, allows big business to do what it does, and allows us to go about our daily lives with much less complication than if we had to think about, are these eggs regulated? Who's certifying? Did anyone check out my car before I purchased it? I think we take for granted all the easy things that government does for us, and we don't have to question or scrutinize, and we can go about our daily lives and be productive and be socially engaged with our families and our communities, and make the great inventions that really do still drive the world.
So with just the last few minutes, I want to give you a chance to sort of talk more positively, of course, about what you, again, describe as the path forward. If we are going to have an administrative state or regime of any kind, what are the things you would like to be able to see that it try to achieve in the foreseeable future?
Yeah. So at the end of the book, I have some reform policies or proposals how we can go forward. And a lot of it is reinvesting and rebuilding the civil service, which has been decimated, not just today, but it's been a 20, 30-year trend and demoralized. And so I think the very first thing is we need to rebuild the civil service. The State Department is losing people by the droves. It's going to take a long time to do. This is not an overnight fix, but we need to start somewhere. And I think in some ways there might be a tipping point now. There might be such a backlash to the, let's say, to the overzealous attacks on bureaucracy that there actually might be an opportunity to build going forward. I think that's a key point about developing a bureaucratic culture that is esteemed, not despised. Okay, that's the first step. The second part, again, is how do we get the public more involved? And not just the special interests, not just those with great sophistication or great resources, but everyone involved. And I lay out a number of steps that we can do in terms of basic civics education, to new technologies, to greater outreach, and this goes to the point about decentralizing federal power, greater outreach so that the EPA comes to you. You don't have to go to Washington for it to be taken seriously and to participate meaningfully. So it's a lot of work. It's not cheap, but this is very important. As I said, it's the most important part of governance that oftentimes we don't have to think about. Maybe we should think about it just a little bit more.
No, I appreciate that very much. And so, of course, this is a terrific book that enables us to sort of think about, as you point out, an incredibly important issue that maybe we don't have the time or even expertise sometimes to be able to understand. So I don't want anybody here to take it for granted. John will be around after this to answer other questions. Obviously, sign copies of his book. You should give yourselves a pat on the back for being able to come out under not pristine conditions. You are the true constitutionalists among us. And always, it's a great pleasure to be here with a terrific opportunity to learn more about the Constitution. Thank you to Jon Michaels.
Thank you.